Welcome back to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, where you find information on what's going on the North Fork of Long Island. We'll be focusing on issues and opportunities going on in the community, as well as people and stories from the present and the past. I'm your host, Christopher Bianchi, and for episode 34, our guest today is John Mancini. He's been a resident of Greenport for over 30 years now, and we talk about his time growing up on Long Island, as well as his career and how he came out onto the North Fork, as well as some of the history of the area, including the story of George Washington coming to Greenport before he was president. And we also talked about the future of Greenport and some of the challenges that the North Fork is facing. So I hope you enjoy episode 34 with John Mancini. This episode was recorded February 29th, 2024. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Oh, my pleasure.
And to start off, could you give us a little introduction about yourself?
Okay, I'm a senior citizen, and I was born in Brooklyn, and I lived there until about 4 years old. My parents got divorced. My mother took my brother and myself out to Long Island, and we lived, I was raised in Amityville. I went through the Amityville school system, got a good education. And then I went to college in Easton, Pennsylvania, Lafayette College, and I graduated with a degree in international affairs and an Army commission. I took ROTC at the time. And at that time was the Vietnam War, and I was scheduled to go in January 1970. So I was a second lieutenant, and I served my active duty in Hawaii, which was a pleasant surprise. And after that, I came out of the Army looking for a job. I started in retail. At that time, maybe still today, the only two jobs available to most people are either in retail or an insurance claims adjuster. Those are the two professions. But fortunately, I had a neighbor who was in the real estate business in Manhattan, managing office buildings. And he took me on. I learned the trade, and I spent 35 years managing all kinds of properties in Manhattan, and some in Long Island City. And that gave me quite an experience dealing with real estate, property management, dealing with tenants, investments, all those things.
Yes. And you said that you were in the ROTC and stationed in Hawaii. That was for Vietnam?
Well, after I graduated, I had to have an active duty commitment. And at that point, I was a second lieutenant in the infantry. And I had my choice of assignments for the first year, and I chose Hawaii. And Vietnam was still going on, but by the time my year was up, the first year, it had wound down in Vietnam. They were Vietnamizing the war, as they said, and they were bringing a lot of troops home. So I managed not to go to Vietnam. But when I was in the Army, I got married. My sweetheart was from Queens, and I had always promised her a trip to Hawaii for our honeymoon, and I had to join the Army to do that. So I brought her with me to Hawaii. So we spent our first year there, and then I settled in Nassau County in Belrose near the Queens border, and we had a daughter in 1985, and now she lives on Staten Island, and I have one grandson.
Wonderful. And I was just wondering, before we get to the North Fork, you said you were in managing with real estate for
35 years.
35 years in Manhattan. I was just curious if you wanted to answer how Manhattan was like over that time, and did you see change through those years?
Well, that's a good question. When I first got there, and I had no experience in Manhattan. I think one of my summer jobs had been a runner in Wall Street, but generally I didn't go to Manhattan that often before the military. And when I first started, I got into a building that was just erected and was totally empty. And so I saw everything from scratch, building out tenant spaces and managing and dealing with new tenants. At that time, it was still sort of a carryover from the mentality of the 50s and 60s. If you ever saw that movie, The Apartment,
Yes.
where you had the men sort of ruled the roost in the business world in Manhattan, and that was still going on right into the 70s. And so I touched on that, but later it became much more diverse. I worked for Helmsley Spear. You know that. My first 10 years I worked for Helmsley Spear. And then I worked for Bernie Mendick, who was brother-in-law to Mr. Silverstein, who was still active in New York real estate. And so you had those entrepreneurs. And then I worked for MetLife, and then I worked for Teachers Insurance. So then I started getting to the corporate side instead of these entrepreneurs. And that's when I started noticing the difference in ownership and dealing with clients, through different owners. So it was a major change that way, but otherwise it was the same kind of thing, commuting. I spent 3 hours a day commuting, either through subway or bus or Long Island Railroad.
You didn't drive into...
No, I didn't drive into Manhattan.
Yeah.
I commuted, and I used that time to read. I read many books.
That's a nice thing about public transit in that way, where you can try to do other reading and take care of other things where you don't have to focus on
Exactly, yeah.
driving.
And sometimes you fall asleep.
Yes.
And many a time I missed my stop because I was asleep. But I used it to my advantage, that commute. You had to get up earlier, and you had to deal with all kinds of inclement weather, waiting for buses and things like that. But that's the way it was. Now, of course, everything's changed because of COVID. People rarely go to work.
Yeah, most
Everything's
people...
remote.
Yes.
And it's like one of the worst things in the world to commute in the minds of many people.
And that we'll probably talk about that a little bit later, but with people on the North Fork and some of the changes post-COVID. But so you're in Nassau, but had you visited the North Fork or the South Fork all that time, come out on the weekend or...
Well, I remember growing up, I lived in Amityville.
Yes.
So I was on Long Island. But I'll tell you the truth, I never went further east than Babylon.
Really?
Really. Jones Beach, and that was it.
You didn't need to come out. Well, some people would come, like you could go to the beaches there, like Jones Beach. You didn't have to come all the way out
No,
here.
I didn't. I had plenty of beaches.
Yeah.
I used to go to Rockaway sometimes because I used to, during the summers, because my parents were divorced, my mother would send me to live with my aunt for the summer. And at times I went back to Brooklyn. When people were climbing trees out in Amityville, I was going back to Tar Beach in Brooklyn for 2 years, 1954 and 1955. I was playing in the streets. No bicycles. We had scooters. We played stickball. We had carpet guns. We were dodging traffic. So I did that for 2 years as a kid. I was 7 years old, 7, 8 years old. And then my aunt moved to Queens. And I used to go spend summers there. So that was sort of suburban, but used to take trips to Jamaica to go to theaters over there. And so I had a lot of things going on west of Amityville. And when I was in the Amityville school system, I was the president of the United Schools of Western Suffolk. So that, I think we had a school maybe in further east, maybe Sayville was part of that. But I had never gone to the North Fork growing up. That started after I got married. And my wife had a friend whose father had a home right on Chapel Lane, off the North Road, and that was my first visit to the North Fork. And he had a boat, and we went fishing, and that was a few weekends that happened.
And what year was that you first came out?
Well, that had to be in the 70s.
70s.
Yeah, the late 70s. And
you came to the North Fork before you never visited the Hamptons?
No.
It's interesting because sometimes when I have interviewed other people, they said, well, I've been to the South Fork a lot, but never to the North Fork. So
let me give you a clue here. I've never been to Fire Island.
Mm-hmm.
I'm 76 years old, and I've never been to Fire Island.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know every part of Long Island. I don't know why, but there's no desire for me to want to go to Fire Island. I don't know anybody.
Yes.
But I came to the North Fork before the South Fork because I knew somebody. And even then, I think I've made a visit downtown Greenport on occasion when we came out here. But I wasn't drawn to the place except because we had this friend.
And how would you describe it when you first came out? I guess the North Fork, and then specifically Greenport, because some people would say it was more going through a transition period and a lot of stuff was closed in the town, or there weren't as many things open, especially in the winter time. But I'm just curious what you kind of remember.
Well, let's take a leap now from the late 70s, when I first came out, occasionally, to when I was looking for a weekend home, which took place in the late 80s, the 1980s. And I was looking for something on the water. I didn't want to move, but I just wanted something for the weekend. And a lot of people were buying homes in the Poconos, but I didn't want to deal with the George Washington Bridge and all that stuff. I said, let me stay on Long Island. We have plenty of waterfront here. That's all I'm looking. I'm not looking for mountains. I'm looking for waterfront. So we used to make weekend trips, my wife and I, to various parts. I mean, not even that far. We used to look in Lindenhurst and even Amityville, South America Road. There's some beach houses there. And but then as I started going through the numbers, because remember I was in real estate, so I knew about mortgages and I knew about overhead and repairs and all those things. So after crunching the numbers, I decided I could not afford a single family weekend home and keep my primary residence at the same time. So I was looking for a multifamily. I wasn't afraid of tenants at that time.
Yes.
And I was dealing with them all the time. So I was scouring the newspapers for some kind of multifamily on the water. And eventually I came upon one in Greenport. It was a 5-family on Sterling Harbor. And I'd never been to Sterling Harbor, and I've never been to that part of the village. And when I saw this place, the first day I saw it, I mean, I was in awe of the harbor and the whole atmosphere at that time. And we decided, after crunching the numbers, we had no children at that. Well, we did. My daughter was 5 years old at that time. But we were able to afford a home with income from the tenants. Now, remember, it was a 5-family. So we had the possibility of having 4 incomes and this apartment for ourselves. And so we took the plunge, and we negotiated. And as I recall, the first time I offered a number, they refused. And that was in the spring, in 1989, I believe. And then by the end of the summer, they couldn't sell this house, so they came back to me. And they accepted my number. And so we closed, and we took possession of the house in 1990. So I've been here 34 years.
And you liked that area over by the Sterling Harbor, and you weren't thinking of Orient or East Marion or other areas?
No, again, it depended on finding this multifamily. And believe me, it's not that easy to find a multifamily on the water. And the downside to the area at that time was there was a fishery right at the end of the block. That created traffic problems. I mean, trucks were coming back and forth, and the owner of the fishery wasn't too neighborly friendly. And the neighbors, when I got there, I found out that the lot next to my house was in contention, that the neighbors were suing the village for rezoning an empty lot, which belonged to the fishery, and they rezoned it from residential to commercial. So I walked into the middle of a lawsuit, and the neighbors came to me and said, well, now that you're a new neighbor, can you contribute to this? So I said, sure, now I have an investment. And I didn't want the fishery next door to me. And there were all kinds of plans. They wanted to put a mini mall there, or they wanted to put a fish hatchery there. It's a small piece of property, so it really was incongruous. So that lawsuit took place, and after a couple of years, we won. And it turned out the village had illegally spot zoned that vacant lot. And that vacant lot now contains 3 residential homes. And the fishery managed to hold on for a while, eventually sold the business to some other foreign company. And that foreign company was not even using local fish, because there weren't any local fish at that quantities. And what they did was they bought fish from Massachusetts and brought it in tractor trailers with the ferry, and they were coming down Sterling Street in front of my house 3 times a day. And then they would package it in the fishery plant on Sterling Street, or Sterling Avenue at that point, and trucking it back out. So we had tractor trailers going back and forth, and that was unpleasant. And eventually the fishery went bust and sold to some other investors, and the fishery was removed, and condos are now put up in that spot. But at that time, when I first bought the house, we still had a fishing business in Greenport. They were processing bunkers twice a year, as I recall, and the smell would fumigate most of Greenport.
You could smell it.
You could smell it, yeah. They were processing these bunkers into dog food or cat food, whatever they do with it. And yeah, that was part of the ambiance of Greenport. It was still a working fishing village, and the downtown area was very kind of seedy, where you have the carousel and the marina and the park today. You had a group of stores run down. Some of them were boarded up. So
Mitchell's Park wasn't.
Yeah, Mitchell Park.
Was that when that came a little bit later?
Yeah, well, it was called. I think it was a restaurant called Mitchell's.
Mitchell's Restaurant.
Yeah,
and that burned down in the 70s.
Right, and people didn't know what to do at that point, because it had been used as a gas station, so the soil was polluted. And it was a challenge for the village to try to figure out what to do with this. And at that time, homes were cheaper because between the smell of the fish and the rundown condition of the village, and we had a police force at that time. Now, for a village with only 1,000 people, and we had a police force, I don't know how many men were on it, but if you have these 7 days, 24-hour shifts, you had to have 10 members of the police force at least. And it was costing $1 million a year. So these were the things that I walked into, and it was still livable. Don't get me wrong; I still enjoyed Sterling Harbor and the village, but there were a lot of things militating against the growth of the village and the prosperity of the village.
And over that time, when did you kind of start to notice change happening? Was it in the 2000s or 2010s?
Well, I don't remember the exact year, but I can tell you who was in charge. That was Mayor Capel, David Capel. And that was the sea change in the village. And even though I came to blows with him a number of times, especially over the rezoning of that property next door to me, because he was on the board. He wasn't the mayor at that time, but so I had come to blows with him over that. But when he became mayor, I've got to admit, he did a magnificent job. The first thing he did was decide we didn't need a police force. And so $1 million was cut from the budget. Our taxes went down. And then he addressed the Mitchell Park situation. He was a wonder worker. And that's when everything changed.
And also, you had mentioned about the house you have. Were you interested in some of the history of the village at that time, looking back, or at the area where you were living?
Well, I'll tell you, I knew that Greenport was a village from the 19th century, the 1800s. I knew that. You could see by the architecture. A lot of the houses were run down, but you could see they were Victorian-type homes. Some were Italianate, which goes back to the 1840s. So I knew that was the era of Greenport. In fact, I think Greenport was incorporated maybe 1832. There was no Greenport before that. It was called Winter Harbor, based on the outer portion of Sterling Creek. Was called Winter Harbor. And so when I bought my house, I figured, well, this thing must be from the 1800s. And we decided to renovate because it was an old house and it needed upgrading. And we wanted to create an apartment for ourselves on the second floor with a deck. And I had a crew come in, and they started tearing out some of the walls. And they said, this is a very peculiar building. So the way they built this, it's not up to code. We don't see the way the construction methods they use here is not familiar to us. And the more they took things apart, we finally found out it was a post and beam construction. These were oak beams. And then I found out from a member of the Sterling Historical Society who walked by the house many times as we were renovating it. And he told me, listen, this house is old. He said, this house, and they gave me a copy of a story on the house in some kind of magazine that was produced. I don't think it's out anymore. But the whole story of the house. And it's dated to 1731. 1731. Now, that's an old house.
Yeah.
And as we uncovered these posts and beams, I was amazed. I started falling in love with this thing because I'm into history. And now here I have a house that predated the American Republic. And you could see the posts, how the huge oak members, and no nail. Well, they had nails on the siding, but the posts and beams were put in with pegs, wood pegs, just like you see the Amish country, the way they build. And now it's a post and beam. It's still a classic way to build a house, post and beam. And you can see Roman numerals etched into the beams. XX1, XX2. And this was indicative, I found out, of a sort of a modular house where they would assemble. They'd have plans, and these beams were cut a certain size. Yeah, these were indicative of an assembly from plans where you put part A into part B, and they use Roman numerals to show you where you joined the post to the beam and all that. So I really got infatuated with this thing, and in fact, when after they finished exposing these things, instead of covering them up, I left them exposed in my apartment. And that's when the person from the Historical Society saw that house and gave me the article. And then he said, by the way, next door was the hotel where George Washington stayed. And he said, that hotel is now in Orient. It's a preserved building in Orient. And I took a trip to Orient, and sure enough, they have a restoration village there. And the house was there. And so my house was next to where George Washington stayed. And then I didn't know when George Washington came. But lo and behold, at the corner of Sterling and Main Street, near the Greek church, is a large stone with a plaque on it from the Historical Society, which said that George Washington visited this area in 1757. Now, that was during the French and Indian War. So now my house and the restoration of the old Orange Webb House, that's what it's called, that hotel where he stayed, which is now in Orient, So now I'm putting all these pieces together. So now as a student of history, I went into George Washington's life and times. Usually people that say George Washington slept here mean when he was president. In the 1790s, he took a tour of Long Island. But this was during the French and Indian War, so this is early, over 30 years before he became president.
Mm-hmm.
So I got involved in studying about George Washington, and I have many details on that. But the first thing that stuck out was, first of all, it wasn't 1757. He had dysentery that year. He wasn't traveling very far from Mount Vernon. And it was 1756 when the French and Indian War started. Yeah, so the French and Indian War had started. The British were against the French and the Indians. I forget which Indians, or the Iroquois Nation or whatever, or the Mohawks. And the big battle was starting in Fort Duquesne, which is Pittsburgh today. So Washington was part of the colonial militia. And the colonial militia was under the command of Governor Shirley of Massachusetts. I don't know, the 13 colonies had some sort of a coalition at that time. They were still subject to the British Crown. And George Washington and his regiment were sent to Fort Duquesne. And there they met up with the General Braddock, the British Army, and his men. And as soon as the two groups met at Fort Duquesne, there was a problem because the British officers didn't recognize the ranks of the colonial officers because they weren't British regulars. They were irregulars. And some sort of animosity took place, and George Washington felt that he wasn't being respected as a colonel. And so he decided the only way to rectify was he was going to go visit Governor Shirley. Now, Pittsburgh is 600 miles from Boston. And George Washington took two slaves, then the man was a slave owner, and two officers with him on a journey on horseback from Fort Duquesne, Pittsburgh, to Boston. And the route he took was through Connecticut. And then he got a piece of paper from Governor Shirley telling the General Braddock or whoever that Colonel Washington was to be respected and given all kinds of military courtesy. So with that paper in hand, Washington was ready to go back to Fort Duquesne. But he said, on the way here through Connecticut, we had a lot of mud. It was rainy. And they said, we're not going back through Connecticut. Let's try Long Island. So he took a boat. I don't know if he took it from Boston or from Newport, but he went to Long Island. And lo and behold, he didn't go to Orient Point. He went to Winter Harbor, the outer portion of Sterling Creek at that time, on Sterling Street, where the confluence of Sterling Street and Sterling Avenue is. And at that point, that's where the Orange Web Hotel was. So they landed at Winter Harbor. There was no Greenport at that point.
Yes.
Main Street led, if you look at when you go past Townsend Manor Inn and the Greek Church, you'll see that the road veers to the left. That was Main Street, the original Main Street. So that goes from the blinking light on the North Road down past Townsend and past the Greek Church, veer left, and that's Sterling Street. And at the end of the block was the Sterling Webb House and the point of landing of George Washington and his four men. So he stayed at the Webb House, but they, according to the Historical Society gentleman, he said, well, they all didn't stay at the hotel. He said Washington stayed there probably with his two slaves, for service, and the two officers stayed at my house. And that was the legend. I don't know for sure. And they only stayed one night, and then the whole group left to go to Brooklyn and back to Fort Duquesne.
Wow.
That was an interesting story.
Yeah, that's an interesting story.
And not many people know about it.
No.
Again, we're not famous for George Washington, and that stone needs to be corrected. The plaque on that stone, they were a year off. But I think it's something that the village should trumpet a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
That George Washington stayed here, like many other places on Long Island, but this was even before those other places.
Yes.
This is 30 years before. Colonel.
No, that's an interesting part of history that I don't think we hear as much within, at least, because you said the other part when he was president, he went to Long Island, but this is, like you said, really way before, and
Yeah, and then Greenport was founded later.
they called it Green Hill at one point, and then Greenport.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, we talk about it being a fishing village, and boat building, the landing crafts and things like that, and about the railroad going. We had the turnaround for the locomotives. We were a hub because it was a hub to go to New England.
yes,
Because the trains would actually load up onto ferries and take the whole freight car up to New England. That part came later, but we're famous for those kinds of things,
yes,
but not for this first visit by George Washington. And it's too bad the hotel was moved. It would
yeah.
have been nice if it stayed here.
That was moved to Orient.
Yeah. And how they moved it, I had, if you read one of the histories of Greenport books, they said they loaded the house onto a barge. But you try to figure out how you can load a house in those days before machinery. You can have as many oxen as you want, but you need solid roads, right?
Yes.
To move this thing on logs or whatever. But the man from the Historical Society said that was rubbish. He said they disassembled it, just like I was talking about. It's post and beam. So once you take down the plaster walls and go down to the posts and beams, you can disassemble it, and moved it that way. And he said that's how they moved it. And I believe it was moved twice. I think once it went to the North Road, and then somebody else said, well, why don't we bring it to Orient to be with the other buildings, the other historical buildings. So it might have been moved twice, but each time it had to be disassembled.
No, that's interesting. Was there anything else, any other tidbits or history that you kind of found out besides that in the area that you thought was interesting?
No, the only other thing was that it was called Sterling Creek at the time. It wasn't really a harbor, and it must have been dredged at some point, maybe in the 20s or 30s, and it became Sterling Harbor, which is also interesting, because if you figure, the person who lived in my house in the 1700s, he had a veritable farm in front of him, an aqua farm. He could walk a few steps and get scallops and oysters, all kinds of fish, right from that creek, because it was flushed out, twice a day with the tides. It was a very healthy place. And then later it became a harbor, and now it's loaded with boats. Well, the fish come in every once in a while, but you don't find much sea life anymore.
No. And then I guess moving forward, what have you seen even since then? You saw kind of when Capel was in and some of the changes then. Moving forward to COVID and post-COVID, how has Greenport changed since then? Has it, because it said that there was even more of a rapid change of, I guess, more with real estate and
Well, I'll tell you, the other big thing besides Capel was the whole transition from potatoes to wine.
The vineyards.
That was a huge
Yes.
change. And in a way, you thought it was going to save the North Fork from overpopulation, because now the farmland was not going to be developed. It was going to be, instead of potatoes, it was going to be vineyards. And it looked great. It's still great.
Yes.
I drink wine. In fact, I make wine. So I'm a fan of wineries. My daughter comes from Staten Island once a year, and she goes to Conacosta. She belongs to the wine club over there. It's just part of the new culture that we have. That's a sea change, really, from the way it used to be. If you imagine just a rundown village with potato farms, that's one thing. But now you're talking about an upscale village with with vineyards and fine restaurants. But with that came the lack of affordability.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it was COVID or just the fact that the South Fork got too expensive, and people needed to find fresh air someplace up island. They had to come out here, and by default, we got the overflow from the South Fork and from all the enriched people now from Western Long Island
Yes.
in the city, Manhattan.
And it's almost like we can't house everyone that wants to move out here, or you start filling in some of the farm country and then you start losing the character
Yeah.
of the area.
Well, yeah, because of the land laws we now have, we can't just develop the farms, which is a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
So what they have to do is concentrate housing somehow.
Yes.
And the affordability is not just for middle class people who want a weekend home.
Mm-hmm.
You're talking about all the service people, the plumbers, the farm workers, all these people. Where are they going to live?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if there's a solution to that. Once you get this big money, there's no end to it. I mean, they'll try to change the zoning laws. They'll try to change density laws. Whatever they have to change to get their money out here, that's a problem. I mean, I came out looking for fresh air and water. I didn't come out here to make $1 million or flip my house. I've been here for 34 years. I haven't flipped anything. But that's different now.
And kind of with some of the short-term rentals or B&Bs and not having having as many full-time residents, and it's a tough situation. Like I don't think there isn't really, like you said, I don't know if there is a solution, and whether you have money coming from the state, that kind of, or the federal government, it doesn't. Sometimes they'll give you the money, but then they'll require you to do certain things, and it might not fit within this specific location. It might fit more in Manhattan or Brooklyn, and it doesn't fit in this.
Well, now they're having a big battle between Southold and the IDA, the Industrial Development
with the
people. They want to give tax breaks, but then Southold's saying, well, what about our schools and our money? We need this money. You can't just impose state regulations and state planning on certain regions because they have different philosophies and they have different missions.
Yes.
I'm happy the way Greenport evolved, but I think too much now depends on money.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's no way you just come out here and enjoy yourself. You have to have the big bucks
to make it work.
Yeah.
But over your time here, what have you enjoyed about living on the North Fork?
Well, it's not my primary residence, but I do vote out here, and I register my car out here, and I come out every week without fail. I've been doing it for 34 years. I mean, that 80 miles from my house, so it's 160 miles a week. I finally bought a hybrid car to save on gas and get into the HOV lane. So I'm enjoying it because it is different from my Nassau, which is my Nassau home is landlocked. I have plenty of trees, and I'm right at the city line, so I could walk to the Long Island Railroad, and I can walk to the city line with all kinds of benefits there. I mean, I have the city bus lines and the subway connection. But coming out here, I still see it as more of a rural point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And so I try to take advantage of that. Being on the water, I have a kayak. I take a swim every once in a while in the harbor.
Mm-hmm.
Those things I certainly can't do in Belrose.
And just kind of down the line, what do you hope for the future of North Fork and Greenport?
Well, again, it's I was hoping my daughter, for instance, and my grandson would gravitate toward Greenport, but as I said, they live in Staten Island, so it's not an easy trip, especially when you start off at the Belt Parkway and the Verrazano Bridge.
Yeah, it's a long...
Yeah, it's a not dependable ride. And So I don't think I'm going to be leaving it, as it were, to my daughter. And so my future here is kind of limited as far as what I can do with the property. But I'm enjoying it while I can. And as far as the village, I mean, I'm still positive about the village. It's very livable, and I have all the services I need to keep going. The restaurants are great. I wish the best for the wineries, and it's good that we have a nice name. We have a reputation now. It's a worldwide reputation, the North Fork.
Yes.
It's all upscale. I mean, maybe in the 70s you say, "Oh, I have a house in Greenport," people look down on you. So, well, it's not the Hamptons. But now if you say you have a house in Greenport, people say, "Oh, that's nice." And you can walk to the Canacosto winery from my house.
Yes.
I can walk to the Long Island Railroad station from my house.
Well, it's
I
very
can take a boat from my house, but
it's very walkable.
yeah. And of course, I use it whenever I go to New England. I take the ferry,
Yes.
so that saves trip through that muddy Connecticut we're talking about.
Yes.
No, I'm very positive as far as the future for Greenport. The only problem is the affordability, and I got mine, Jack, as they say. How other people are going to capture this moment, I don't know. It's tough.
Definitely.
Unless you inherit a lot of money.
Yeah. And I guess just was there anything else you'd like to talk about or discuss that we haven't?
No, I think we've covered all the points, and I hope I've given a positive view of everything. If looking over the 34 years, it's all positive at this point.
Thank you so much for coming on today and telling your story and history about the area and what you've enjoyed and your thoughts on the North Fork.
I'm glad the opportunity, Chris.
Thank you. Well, I hope you enjoyed episode 34 with John Mancini. I want to thank you for listening to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast. We'll see you next time.